When we think of the great artists of the past, there is often a very strong link between their art and the hardship they faced in their own life. This idea of the tortured artist brings names like Van Gogh to mind, the genius painter who suffered from psychosis and once cut his ear off to send as a gift to a prostitute. Or more recently, somebody like Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain, who struggled with depression and drug use for most of his life, which unfortunately culminated in his suicide. There is something poetic about a troubled person translating parts of their tragic life into a beautiful piece of art. And this is likely why the idea of the tortured artist has prevailed so much within popular culture. But is it really so that an artist must have a life riddled with problems and hardship for him to create good art? Or is the truth rather the artists struggle with these things just as much as ordinary people, but they instead use their art as an outlet to distance themselves from their suffering? One of the most enthralling tales of a troubled artist using art as an escape that I've ever seen is that of Paul Schrader, a film critic turned screenwriter. At the time that Schrader wrote what many consider his magnum opus, Taxi Driver, it was 1973, and he was 26 years old and destitute. He had left his wife, his mistress, but it wouldn't be long before Schrader would also break things off with her, and so with nowhere to turn, Schrader was living in his car, going to porno theaters at night, and driving around the city during the day just to kill the time. It was a very dark time for him. He drank heavily, all day, every day, and was almost completely isolated from people. Eventually, when this self-destructive lifestyle caught up with Schrader, and he visited the emergency room with a throbbing pain, the nurse informed him that he had an ulcer. Talking to the nurse, he realized he hadn't had a proper conversation with another person in weeks. And this was the conception of the idea for Taxi Driver. It really hit me. An image that I was like a taxi driver, floating around in this metal coffin in the city, seemingly in the middle of people, but absolutely, totally alone. The taxi cab was a metaphor for loneliness, and once I had that, it was just a matter of creating a plot. His long nights at X-rated theaters winded down when he moved in to live with his ex-girlfriend, sleeping on her couch. Schrader would begin writing the screenplay for Taxi Driver during this stint. He didn't write the script with any market in mind. He wrote it because he felt he had to, that if he didn't get this story down on paper, he would only continue down this path of self-destruction. The main character of Travis acted as a lamb that was sacrificed to save Schrader from his own demons, as Schrader has made it clear that the character was a very true-to-life representation of who he was at the time. And so, alternating from sleeping on the couch and getting up and writing away on his typewriter, the story of Taxi Driver flowed out of Schrader. Being completed in a mere 2 weeks, a ridiculous time frame for a completed script, he had essentially finished writing the feature in a sixth of the usual 12 weeks given to commissioned screenwriters. But that was because Schrader wasn't writing for a studio or a director. He was writing for himself, to save himself from the man he was scared he might become. The angst that Travis has in Taxi Driver is a real reflection of how his creator was feeling, and by writing the script and creating this character, Schrader was able to separate himself from this self-destructive version of himself. The story of how Paul Schrader wrote Taxi Driver is interesting in the fact that it's common for artists to draw influence from their life as inspiration for a project. But the link between this story and Schrader's own life is much more visceral, and this is very likely what led to the film being made in the first place, and earning the commercial and critical acclaim that it did. In the early 80s, he began developing a film with his brother about renowned Japanese author Yukio Mishima. Mishima had committed seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, over a decade earlier, at the age of 45. A lot of Mishima's life was directly conveyed through his work, be it the themes of death, eroticism, and beauty. They were present in almost every one of his novels. One of Mishima's first books he wrote was Forbidden Colors, a book about an older man developing a sexual infatuation with a young boy. Many have sleuthed that Mishima was a homosexual, despite being married with kids, and have used this book as a prime reason to support their claim. A much more direct link, though, that we can see between Mishima and his writing is that of his death. Mishima wrote constantly of the beauty of death, how he despised old age and wished to die young. The characters in his books were often hot-headed youths who shared much of his worldview. Mishima even took part in a film, playing a young soldier that kills himself by seppuku, only a couple years before Mishima would do so himself. The writings were on the wall. Mishima's art didn't work as an effective outlet for him, especially for his most self-destructive desires, something that Schrader pointed out too when interviewed on his film about Mishima.
I'm one of these people that believes art actually works. art works?
It works, that you can purge certain antisocial feelings through either watching or creating a surrogate. And so that by writing about a taxi driver or seeing one, you don't have to be one. I actually believe, art has a social function in that way. For Mishima, it didn't. Every time he created a successful fantasy, a book, a play, and it was vastly popular, all it did was drove his fantasy needs up to yet a higher level. And they became more and more hyperbolic, and eventually they took over his private life. This is fascinating because here was a extremely good writer and very famous and very celebrated, but for whom art really wasn't working. It was only making his problems greater.
The way Schrader saw Yukio Mishima's life, Mishima used art as an extension of his desires, instead of putting it to paper and seeing the harm it could cause not only to himself, but to his family and friends. It instead further highlighted the beauty of it in Mishima's eyes. He was an example of a tortured artist that wasn't capable of using art to save himself. Much like Van Gogh before him and Cobain after him, the tortured artist is a continued occurrence throughout history. Schrader is almost rare among this crowd, managing to purge his problems before they killed him. Another man whose life was saved by creating art was someone who was a very close collaborator with Paul Schrader. Martin Scorsese was the man who directed Taxi Driver and gave life to Schrader's script, and he would go on to do it again a couple years later when they collaborated on Raging Bull, a boxing film about the tumultuous life of middleweight champion Jake LaMotta. Scorsese, however, wasn't sold on this idea at all to begin with. He didn't like sports films and stated that he had little interest in making a film centered around boxing, and so he passed up the offer to another director. But as the 70s drew to a close, the situation would change drastically. Scorsese suffered a near-fatal overdose after years of struggling with a cocaine addiction, which would lead to him having a prolonged stay at a hospital, suffering from serious internal bleeding from the drug abuse. Those that were close to him agreed that Scorsese was not only killing his body, but he was also suffering a great deal mentally. A grave cloud of depression seemed to hover over him at this time. And so, while Scorsese was in the hospital, his close friend Robert De Niro went to visit him. He asked Scorsese whether he wanted to live or die. He was the only one who could save himself. And if he wanted to live, De Niro proposed, "This boxing film, Raging Bull, let's make this picture," he told Scorsese. And so, after he recovered, Scorsese and De Niro would soon begin work on Raging Bull, as a means not only to save Scorsese's career, but to save the man himself, which, by all appearances, seems to have worked. In the short term, the film had difficulty at the box office, barely scraping together the cost of production, but as time went by, it's become regarded as not only one of Scorsese's strongest films, but one of the best of all time. The litany of success that Scorsese saw not only into the 80s, but especially through the 90s, with box office hits like Goodfellas and Casino, marked a clear stability that had since been established in Scorsese's life. And Scorsese, now being a man in his early 80s that is continuing to direct successful movies, speaks volumes to the effect that De Niro had on him when he gave his ailing friend an ultimatum over 40 years ago. Scorsese saw a part of himself in Jake LaMotta. It was an allegory for whatever you did in life. "You make movies," he said, "you're in the ring each time.